Hey, beautiful people. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Today's story is about judging a book by its cover, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. On a warm evening in downtown Los Angeles, the prestigious La Maison Rouge restaurant buzzed with its usual sophisticated energy. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over white tablecloths, while waiters in perfectly pressed uniforms glided between tables, serving the city's elite. This was where Hollywood deals were made, where celebrities dined, and where a meal could easily cost more than most people's weekly salary. But on this particular evening, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Through the grand entrance walked a man whose appearance seemed completely at odds with the restaurant's upscale atmosphere. His well-worn jeans bore the honest dirt of a day's work, his plain white t-shirt had seen better days, and his scuffed work boots told stories of countless hours spent on his feet. This man was Chuck Norris, though few would recognize him in this moment. He'd just spent the entire day at his martial arts youth program in one of the city's underprivileged neighborhoods, teaching kids not just about self-defense, but about self-respect, discipline, and the importance of giving back to their community. The sweat and dirt on his clothes were badges of honor from demonstrating moves, fixing equipment, and even helping repair the community center's roof. Chuck hadn't bothered to change before coming to dinner. Why should he? He'd learned long ago that true worth had nothing to do with outer appearances. His reservation had been made weeks in advance, a quiet dinner to celebrate another successful year of his youth program. He'd chosen La Maison Rouge not for its prestige, but because he genuinely appreciated their world-class chef's artistry with food. As he stepped into the lobby, the contrast between his appearance and the surrounding luxury couldn't have been more stark. Women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits cast sidelong glances his way. Some whispered behind manicured hands, while others didn't even try to hide their disapproving stares. Chuck noticed it all, of course. Years of martial arts training had honed his awareness to near supernatural levels, but the judgmental looks rolled off him like water off a duck's back. He stood there quietly confident, his weathered face bearing the subtle hint of a smile. In his pocket was a reservation confirmation for one of the best tables in the house, but he waited patiently like anyone else would. The maitre d's station was currently occupied by a young waiter who clearly took pride in the restaurant's exclusive reputation. This was Marcus, though Chuck didn't know it yet. Even from a distance, Chuck could read the young man's body language, the slight raise of his eyebrows, the almost imperceptible curl of his lip, the way he straightened his already perfect posture, as if to emphasize the difference between them. What no one in the restaurant knew was that this simple moment would become a turning point in several lives. Chuck's unassuming presence was about to teach lessons about humility, respect, and the danger of judging others based on appearances, and it would all begin with a simple dinner reservation. As Chuck approached the maitre d's station, he maintained his characteristic calm demeanor. His eyes, sharp and alert despite his relaxed posture, took in every detail of his surroundings. He'd faced down countless opponents in the ring and on screen, but sometimes the most important battles were the quiet ones, the ones that could change hearts and minds. Little did anyone know this evening would become one of those moments, a story that would be told and retold, not because of its drama or conflict, but because of the profound impact it would have on everyone involved. And it all started with a man in worn jeans and work boots walking into one of LA's finest restaurants, carrying himself with the quiet dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. Marcus had been working at La Maison Rouge for exactly 8 months and 17 days, and in that time, he'd developed what he considered an infallible sense for who belonged and who didn't. His entire identity had become wrapped up in the restaurant's prestigious reputation. Every wealthy patron who walked through those doors validated his own sense of importance, as if their status somehow rubbed off on him through proximity alone. When he saw Chuck Norris approach, though he didn't recognize him, his carefully manicured world felt suddenly disturbed. Here was someone who clearly didn't fit the carefully curated image of La Maison Rouge. Marcus's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the leather-bound reservation book as he watched the man approach, leaving invisible scuff marks on the pristine marble floor with those working-class boots. "Good evening," Marcus said, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. Can I help you? The pause was deliberate, a subtle suggestion that help might not be available for someone of this apparent status. Chuck smiled warmly, either missing or choosing to ignore the condescension. Yes, I have a reservation for 7 o'clock. His voice was steady and confident, carrying the natural authority of someone who had nothing to prove. Marcus made a show of flipping through the reservation book, his manicured fingers trailing down the list of names with exaggerated care. Your name, sir? The word sir came out like an afterthought, a formality stripped of its usual respect. Norris, Chuck replied simply. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he scanned the page. Unfortunately, he did find the name, though he was certain there must be some mistake. Surely this couldn't be the same Norris who had reserved one of their premier tables, that Norris had called from a prestigious Beverly Hills number. I see a reservation for a Mr. Norris, Marcus said slowly, his tone suggesting he'd found a suspicious contradiction. But surely there must be some mistake. That reservation is for one of our premium tables. He emphasized the word premium as if explaining a complex concept to a child. Chuck remained unruffled. That's correct. Marcus's lip curled slightly. In his mind, he was protecting the restaurant's reputation, maintaining its standards. He couldn't possibly seat someone dressed like this at one of their best tables. What would the other patrons think? Sir, Marcus began, his voice lowered to what he considered a discreet volume. I'm afraid La Maison Rouge maintains certain standards. Perhaps I could recommend somewhere more suitable. He gestured vaguely toward the door, implying that suitable meant elsewhere. Several nearby patrons had begun to notice the exchange. Some watched with barely concealed interest, while others pretended not to notice, while hanging on every word. Marcus was playing to this audience now, assuming they shared his disdain for this apparent intruder in their exclusive domain. Chuck's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something more like understanding. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, had dealt with it countless times throughout his life. Even now, after all his success, moments like these served as reminders of why he kept his youth program running, why he taught young people about respect and dignity. The reservation is under Norris, Chuck repeated calmly. 7 o'clock. I'd appreciate being shown to my table. Marcus's fingers drummed against the reservation book. He was caught in a bind. The reservation was legitimate, but everything in him rebelled against seating this man among their elite clientele. In his mind, he was already formulating a plan to seat Chuck at one of the less desirable tables, preferably near the kitchen where he wouldn't be too visible to the restaurant's more appropriate guests. Very well, Marcus said finally, his tone suggesting he was making an enormous concession. If you'll follow me. He grabbed a menu, not the leather-bound ones reserved for VIP guests, but a slightly worn one from the stack they kept for walk-ins, and gestured for Chuck to follow him. As they moved through the restaurant, Marcus held his head high, as if to distance himself from the man walking behind him. He was already thinking about how he would explain this situation to his fellow servers, how they would laugh later about the guy who showed up in work boots and tried to act like he belonged. Little did Marcus know, his entire world-view was about to be shaken to its core. His carefully constructed hierarchy of worth based on appearance and status was about to crumble, and the man he was now treating with such disdain would be the one to teach him one of life's most valuable lessons. The stage was set for a humbling experience that would change not just Marcus's evening, but his entire perspective on life. And it would all unfold in the next few hours within the elegant confines of La Maison Rouge, where appearances, as everyone was about to learn, could be very deceiving indeed. Marcus led Chuck through the elegant dining room, deliberately taking a path that would expose him to as many curious stares as possible. They passed table after table of finely dressed patrons, the gentle clink of expensive wine glasses, and soft murmur of sophisticated conversation following them as they walked. Instead of the premium table that had been reserved, a corner booth with a perfect view of both the room and the city lights beyond, Marcus steered them toward the back of the restaurant. The table he chose was tucked away in a shadowy corner near the kitchen doors, where the constant swing of servers and the clatter of dishes created an unwelcome symphony of disruption. "Your table, sir," Marcus announced with fake politeness, placing the worn menu on the small table. The surface wobbled slightly. This was the table they usually used for staff meals, and everyone knew it had an uneven leg. "I trust this will be adequate." Chuck pulled out the slightly uncomfortable chair and sat down, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying no trace of sarcasm or anger. This only seemed to fuel Marcus's determination to make him feel out of place. "Shall I explain how our menu works?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting he was speaking to someone who had never dined in a fine restaurant before. "The prices are listed in small numbers beside each item." He pointed to the menu with an exaggerated gesture. A couple at a nearby table exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had recognized something familiar about Chuck but couldn't quite place him. Still, they could tell something wasn't right about the way he was being treated. "Perhaps," Marcus continued, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by surrounding tables, "you'd like to hear about our more modest offerings?" He emphasized the word modest while gesturing to the appetizer section, which contained the least expensive items on the menu. Chuck opened the menu calmly, his eyes scanning the offerings with genuine interest. "Actually," he said, "I'd like to hear about your chef's specialties first. I understand Chef Laurent has an excellent way with the duck confit." Marcus's eyebrows raised slightly. He hadn't expected this apparent working-class customer to know anything about their acclaimed chef or his signature dishes. "Yes," he replied, slightly thrown off but quickly recovering his condescending demeanor. "Though I should mention the duck confit is one of our more premium offerings." More diners were starting to notice the scene unfolding in the corner. The constant swing of the kitchen doors created sharp bursts of light that illuminated Chuck's table intermittently, like a spotlight on an unfolding drama. Each time the doors opened, a blast of kitchen noise would interrupt the elegant atmosphere that Marcus tried so hard to maintain. "Would Sir prefer to see our wine list?" Marcus asked, though he hadn't brought one to the table, though perhaps a glass of house wine would be more appropriate. The suggestion was clearly meant to be insulting. La Maison Rouge didn't even serve house wine. Chuck met Marcus's gaze steadily. "I'd appreciate seeing the full wine list, thank you." His voice remained perfectly pleasant, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength that made Marcus hesitate for just a moment, before nodding stiffly and walking away to fetch it. As Marcus disappeared toward the wine storage, whispers began circulating among the nearby tables. Several patrons had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort. There was something about the quiet dignity with which Chuck handled the situation that made Marcus's behavior seem increasingly inappropriate. A young couple at the next table kept stealing glances at Chuck, the woman whispering to her companion, "I swear I know him from somewhere." The man squinted, trying to place the familiar face, but the dim lighting in this corner of the restaurant made it difficult to see clearly. When Marcus returned with the wine list, again not the premium leather-bound version, but a laminated list they kept for the bar, he placed it on the table with barely concealed contempt. "Will Sir need help understanding the vintages and regions?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Chuck opened the list and began reading it with the ease of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. This seemed to irritate Marcus even more, his carefully constructed narrative about this customer beginning to show cracks. The kitchen door swung open again, sending another burst of light and noise across the scene. In that brief moment of illumination, more diners caught a clear glimpse of Chuck's face, and the whispers began to increase. There was definitely something familiar about him, something that nagged at their memories. Marcus, however, remained oblivious to the growing recognition among the other patrons. He was too focused on maintaining his air of superiority, on making sure this apparently working-class intruder knew he didn't belong in this temple of fine dining. But with each passing moment, with each calm response from Chuck, the waiter's behavior seemed increasingly petty and unprofessional. The stage was set for the next act in this unfolding drama, and Marcus had no idea that his carefully maintained world of status and judgment was about to be turned completely upside down. From her private office overlooking the main dining room, Maria Rossi watched the scene unfold through the one-way glass window. As the owner of La Maison Rouge, she had installed this observation point to monitor service quality and ensure her high standards were consistently met. Tonight, however, she was witnessing something that made her blood boil and smile at the same time. The moment Chuck Norris had walked through her restaurant's doors, Maria had recognized him instantly. How could she not? His movies had inspired her as a young immigrant to pursue her dreams, to fight for what she wanted despite all odds. The fact that he was here, in her restaurant, should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, she was watching one of her waiters commit professional suicide. Maria's fingers drummed against her mahogany desk as she observed Marcus's behavior. She had hired him 8 months ago, impressed by his knowledge of fine dining and attention to detail. But lately, she'd noticed his growing arrogance, the way he seemed to judge guests based on their appearance rather than treating everyone with equal respect. Through the window, she could see Chuck sitting at that awful table near the kitchen, a placement that made her wince. She knew that table. It was the one they used for staff meals, the one with the wobble that nobody had quite managed to fix. And there sat Chuck Norris, martial arts legend and humanitarian, being treated like an unwelcome intruder in her restaurant. But Maria didn't intervene. Not yet. Years of experience had taught her that sometimes the best lessons were learned through natural consequences. She could see the whispers starting among the other diners, the growing recognition in their eyes. It was only a matter of time before someone identified him. She watched as Marcus paraded past the premium tables with their elegant table settings and perfectly positioned wine glasses, past the intimate booths where Hollywood deals were made nightly, only to seat one of the most respected actors and philanthropists in Hollywood at the worst table in the house. What impressed her most was Chuck's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. There was no anger, no indignation, not even a hint of irritation. He sat there with the same quiet dignity she remembered from his interviews and public appearances, handling Marcus's condescension with a grace that spoke volumes about his character. Maria picked up her tablet and pulled up Chuck's reservation details. He had booked through their private concierge service, requesting a quiet table for one. The notes indicated he was celebrating another successful year of his youth program. The same youth program that had inspired Maria to start her own scholarship program for underprivileged culinary students. Through the window she could see Marcus returning with what appeared to be the bar's laminated wine list instead of their premium leather-bound collection. Maria shook her head, making a mental note to address this blatant violation of service standards. But not yet. She could sense that something bigger was about to unfold. The other diners were starting to take notice. She watched as people at neighboring tables stole glances at Chuck, their expressions shifting from initial disdain to confusion to growing recognition. The whispers were spreading like ripples in a pond, table by table, section by section. Maria smiled as she remembered the first time she'd seen a Chuck Norris movie. She'd been working as a dishwasher in a small Italian restaurant, dreaming of owning her own place someday. His characters always stood for justice, for doing what was right regardless of the circumstances. Those movies had given her hope during tough times. Now, watching him handle this situation with such composure, she realized he wasn't just playing those roles, he was living them. Here was a man who could have demanded the manager's attention the moment he walked in, who could have put Marcus in his place with a single word. Instead, he was allowing events to unfold naturally, perhaps understanding that sometimes the best lessons come through experience rather than instruction. Through the kitchen doors, Maria could see her staff whispering among themselves. Word was spreading that something was happening in the dining room. She knew it wouldn't be long before someone recognized Chuck, before Marcus's carefully constructed world of judgment and prejudice came crashing down around him. But for now, she would wait and watch. This was turning into a masterclass in humility and grace, and Maria had a feeling that everyone in her restaurant, staff and guests alike, was about to learn a valuable lesson about judging books by their covers. The evening was about to take a turn that would transform not just Marcus's perspective, but the very atmosphere of La Maison Rouge, and Maria had the best seat in the house to watch it all unfold. As Marcus approached Chuck's table once again, he noticed the worn menu was open to the wine section. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He had hoped this clearly out-of-place customer would stick to water, or at most, a basic house wine. Instead, Chuck was studying the wine list with the focused attention of a connoisseur. "Have you made a selection?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting he expected something embarrassingly uninformed. "Perhaps I could suggest something more accessible?" The word accessible dripped with condescension. Chuck looked up from the menu, his expression thoughtful. Yes, I believe I'll have the 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild. His pronunciation of the French name was perfect, each syllable flowing naturally. Marcus couldn't suppress a smirk. Sir, he said, emphasizing the word with mock politeness, I feel I should inform you that the Chateau Lafite Rothschild is priced at $4,500 per bottle. He said this loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, clearly expecting Chuck to withdraw the order in embarrassment. Yes, I'm aware, Chuck replied calmly. It's an excellent vintage. I had the pleasure of visiting the vineyard in '85. The terroir that year was exceptional. Marcus's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the response he had expected. The casual mention of visiting the vineyard, the knowledge of terroir, it didn't fit with the narrative he had constructed about this customer. Perhaps, Marcus persisted, his voice taking on an edge of desperation, you'd like to see the price again? I wouldn't want there to be any misunderstandings when the bill arrives. Chuck met Marcus's gaze steadily. The price is fine, though I have to say I believe you're storing it incorrectly. Lafite Rothschild should be kept at exactly 55 degrees Fahrenheit, not the 57 degrees you're currently using in your wine cellar. A soft gasp came from a nearby table. Marcus's face reddened. Chuck was exactly right about their wine cellar temperature, and everyone who worked there knew it had been a point of contention among wine enthusiasts. I'll fetch the wine, Marcus stammered, his composure cracking for the first time. As he turned to leave, Chuck's voice stopped him. One more thing, Chuck said quietly. The Lafite Rothschild should be decanted for at least 30 minutes before serving. And please use the crystal decanter, not the glass one you were planning to bring. Marcus froze mid-step. That had been exactly his plan, to bring the cheaper decanter, assuming this customer wouldn't know the difference. His hands began to tremble slightly as he realized he was dealing with someone far more knowledgeable than he had assumed. The surrounding tables had gone quiet, all pretense of not listening now abandoned. They watched as Marcus's carefully constructed air of superiority crumbled in the face of Chuck's expertise. Of course, sir, Marcus managed to say, his earlier condescension replaced by uncertainty. He hurried away toward the wine cellar, his steps lacking their previous confident swagger. Chuck returned to studying the menu, seemingly unaffected by the exchange. But the other diners had noticed something else during the interaction. In the bright light that had accompanied the opening of the kitchen doors, they had gotten a clear view of his face. The whispers began to grow louder. When Marcus returned with the properly decanted wine, his hands were visibly shaking. He presented the bottle for inspection, following proper wine service protocol for the first time that evening. Chuck examined the label carefully, nodded his approval, and watched as Marcus poured a small amount for tasting. Chuck swirled the wine gently, examining its color and clarity before taking in its bouquet. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his verdict. After a careful sip, he nodded again. Perfect, thank you, Marcus. The use of his name, which he hadn't shared with Chuck, startled Marcus. He looked down and realized with horror that in his flustered state, he had forgotten to remove his name tag, something they were supposed to do with premium guests. As Marcus finished pouring the wine, his world was slowly unraveling. Everything he thought he knew about this customer, every judgment he had made, was proving not just wrong, but embarrassingly so. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a nagging question was beginning to form. Just who was this man? He was about to find out, and the revelation would shake him to his core. The moment that would shatter Marcus's carefully constructed world began with the excited whisper of a 12-year-old boy seated 3 tables away. The young diner had been stealing glances at Chuck throughout the evening, his expression growing increasingly certain with each look. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, the boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, though in the now quiet restaurant, his voice carried further than intended. "That's Chuck Norris. I'm sure of it. He came to my karate tournament last month." The whisper sparked an immediate chain reaction throughout the dining room. Heads turned, eyes widened, and sudden recognition dawned on face after face. The transformation in the atmosphere was instant and electric. Marcus, who had just finished pouring the wine, nearly dropped the empty bottle. His hands began to tremble as the reality of the situation crashed over him. He turned slowly, looking at Chuck with new eyes, and the blood drained from his face as he finally recognized the man he had been condescending to all evening. The young boy, despite his parents' attempts to restrain him, slipped from his chair and approached Chuck's table. His eyes were shining with admiration and excitement. "Mr. Norris, I'm sorry to bother you, but you presented me with my blue belt last month. You told me never to give up, no matter what anyone says." Chuck's face broke into a warm smile, the first full smile he'd shown all evening. "I remember you, Tommy. Your roundhouse kick was excellent. Have you been practicing?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "Every day, sir, just like you said." By now, the entire restaurant was watching the interaction. The contrast between Chuck's gentle interaction with the boy and Marcus's earlier treatment was stark and unmistakable. Marcus stood frozen, the empty wine bottle still in his hands, as he watched the martial arts legend he'd spent the evening mocking interact with his young fan. Other diners began to approach the table, their earlier disdain replaced by embarrassment and admiration. "Mr. Norris, we're so sorry we didn't recognize you earlier," one woman said, casting a pointed look at Marcus. "No apologies necessary," Chuck replied graciously. "A person's worth isn't measured by their recognition or status." His eyes met Marcus's as he spoke, the message clear, but not unkind. The kitchen doors swung open and several of the kitchen staff peered out, having heard the commotion. One of the line cooks, a young man who practiced martial arts himself, immediately recognized Chuck and let out an audible gasp. Marcus's world was spinning. The man he had seated at the worst table in the house, the man he had openly mocked and condescended to, was not just any celebrity, he was Chuck Norris, a legendary martial artist, actor, and philanthropist, known as much for his humanitarian work as for his fighting skills. Tommy's father had approached now, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Mr. Norris, I want to thank you for what you've done with the youth program. It's changed my son's life." Chuck engaged warmly with each person who approached, his manner exactly the same as it had been when Marcus was treating him poorly. There was no hint of smugness, no sign that he was enjoying Marcus's discomfort. The waiter stood there, still clutching the empty wine bottle, as the reality of his behavior throughout the evening played back in his mind. Every condescending remark, every deliberate slight, every attempt to embarrass this man, it all came rushing back with horrifying clarity. Some of the other waitstaff had emerged from the service areas, drawn by the commotion. They stared open-mouthed at the scene unfolding before them, then turned accusatory eyes toward Marcus. They had all witnessed his behavior earlier, and now they watched as his comeuppance arrived in the form of this gentle revelation. Marcus finally managed to set down the wine bottle, his hands shaking so badly he nearly missed the table. His carefully maintained facade of superiority had crumbled completely, replaced by a crushing sense of shame and embarrassment. Chuck, however, showed no sign of enjoying Marcus's discomfort. Instead, he treated each interaction with genuine warmth and interest, his dignity and grace serving as a stark contrast to the treatment he had received. The evening had reached its turning point, but the most profound lessons were yet to come. For Marcus, the revelation of Chuck's identity was just the beginning of what would become a life-changing experience. As the initial wave of recognition and excitement began to settle, Marcus found himself rooted to the spot, his entire body rigid with mortification. Chuck, noticing the waiter's distress, did something unexpected. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Marcus," Chuck said quietly, his voice carrying no trace of anger or resentment, "would you join me for a moment?" It wasn't really a question despite its gentle delivery. The other diners, sensing a private moment about to unfold, respectfully returned to their tables, though many continued to watch from the corners of their eyes. Tommy, the young karate student, gave Chuck one last beaming smile before returning to his parents. Marcus sank into the chair, his legs barely able to support him anymore. "Mr. Norris," he began, his voice trembling, I don't know what to say. My behavior was—" "Let me tell you a story," Chuck interrupted softly. "When I was first starting out in martial arts, I was nothing special. Just a young man from a small town in Oklahoma, trying to make something of himself. I walked into my first dojo wearing clothes that weren't much different from what I'm wearing now. Marcus glanced down at his own pristine uniform, then at Chuck's work-worn clothes, seeing them with entirely new eyes. The instructor there, Chuck continued, could have judged me by my appearance, could have decided I didn't belong. Instead, he taught me one of the most valuable lessons I've ever learned, that true strength has nothing to do with what's on the outside. The kitchen doors swung open again, but this time Marcus didn't even notice the noise. He was completely focused on Chuck's words. "You know what that instructor did?" Chuck asked, taking a sip of his wine. "He put me through the same grueling training as everyone else. He pushed me to my limits. But not once did he treat me as anything less than worthy of being there." Marcus swallowed hard, the parallel to his own behavior painfully clear. "That man changed my life," Chuck said, setting down his glass. "Not just by teaching me martial arts, but by showing me what real dignity looks like. He taught me that how we treat others says more about us than it does about them." A tear slipped down Marcus's cheek, but he didn't even try to wipe it away. "I've been so foolish," he whispered. "No," Chuck corrected gently. "You've been human. We all make judgments. The question is what we learn from them and how we choose to grow." Chuck leaned forward slightly. "You know, I could have told you who I was the moment I walked in. Could have demanded better treatment. But would that have taught either of us anything?" Marcus shook his head slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The clothes I'm wearing," Chuck continued, gesturing to his dirty work outfit, "these are my badges of honor from today. Every spot of dirt, every bit of wear, they come from teaching kids at my youth program. Kids who, like I once was, might not look like they belong in certain places, but they deserve every chance, every opportunity, just like anyone else." The restaurant had grown quiet, Chuck's words carrying to nearby tables. Several diners were nodding, some wiping away tears of their own. "The real measure of a person," Chuck said, his voice growing firmer, "isn't in how they treat those they think are important. It's in how they treat everyone else. Every person who walks through that door is somebody's Chuck Norris, somebody's hero, somebody's inspiration, somebody's everything." Marcus looked down at his hands, remembering how they had trembled when pouring the wine. "How can I ever make this right?" he asked quietly. Chuck smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "By remembering this moment, by choosing to see people, really see them, instead of just their appearances. By understanding that every person who walks into this restaurant deserves the same respect you'd give to someone you admire." The lesson was sinking in, not just for Marcus, but for everyone within earshot. Chuck's words carried the weight of lived experience, of hard-won wisdom. "The greatest battles," Chuck concluded, "aren't fought with fists or feet. They're fought within ourselves, against our own prejudices and assumptions. Those are the victories that truly matter." Marcus straightened in his chair, something shifting in his expression. It was more than shame now. It was understanding, and with it, the first glimmer of real change. As Chuck's words settled over the restaurant like a gentle blanket of wisdom, Maria emerged from her office. She had watched the entire evening unfold, waiting for the perfect moment to make her presence known. Now, as she approached Chuck's table, her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, drawing all eyes in her direction. "Mr. Norris," she said, her voice carrying both warmth and authority, "I'm Maria Rossi, the owner of La Maison Rouge. I've been watching this evening's events unfold, and I owe you an apology for the treatment you've received." Chuck started to wave off the apology, but Maria held up her hand. "Please," she continued, "allow me to share something with you, and with Marcus." She pulled up a chair, completing their small circle at the humble corner table. 20 years ago," Maria began, her voice thick with emotion, "I was watching one of your movies in a tiny apartment above the restaurant where I worked as a dishwasher. I had just immigrated to this country, barely spoke English, and was struggling to hold on to my dreams of owning my own restaurant." Marcus listened intently, having never heard this story from his employer before. Other staff members had drawn closer, forming a respectful semicircle around the table. "In that movie," Maria continued, "your character said something that changed my life. The biggest obstacle in life isn't the obstacle itself. It's letting others tell you it can't be overcome." Those words gave me the strength to keep going when everyone said a female immigrant couldn't succeed in the restaurant business. Chuck's eyes softened with understanding. "I remember that line," he said quietly. "It wasn't just a script. It was something I truly believed." "Those words became my mantra," Maria said, gesturing at the elegant restaurant around them. "Every time someone said I couldn't do it, every time a bank denied my loan application, every time a potential investor looked at me and saw only my gender or my accent, I remembered those words." She turned to Marcus, her expression firm but kind. "That's why watching your behavior tonight was particularly painful. This restaurant exists because someone chose to see past appearances and give me a chance. And here we were doing exactly what was once done to me, judging someone based on their clothes, their appearance." Marcus hung his head, but Maria gently touched his arm. "No, look up. This isn't about shame. It's about growth, about understanding why we're here, what this restaurant really stands for." She turned back to Chuck. "Mr. Norris, your youth program inspired me to start something similar here. We have a culinary scholarship program for underprivileged youth. Every year we take on 5 students who might not otherwise have the opportunity to learn fine dining cuisine." Chuck's eyes lit up with interest. "That's remarkable, Maria. How many students have gone through the program?" 37 so far," she said proudly. "Many of them now have their own restaurants. Some work here teaching the next generation. We're not just serving meals, we're serving dreams, opportunities, second chances." She looked pointedly at Marcus. "Just like the second chance you're being offered tonight?" "None." Marcus straightened in his chair, understanding flooding his features. "The scholarship program, I had no idea. All this time I've been so focused on maintaining what I thought was the restaurant's image, I missed its heart completely." "Exactly," Maria said. "La Maison Rouge isn't about exclusivity. It's about excellence. Excellence in food, in service, and most importantly, in how we treat every single person who walks through those doors." Chuck nodded approvingly. "The best lessons often come full circle," he said. "Your restaurant, Maria, is carrying forward the same message that once inspired you. And tonight, that message has found a new audience." Maria stood, her posture straight and proud. "Mr. Norris, your dinner tonight is of course on the house. But more than that, I want you to know that you'll always have a home here at La Maison Rouge, whether you're wearing a tuxedo or work boots." The gathered staff members nodded in agreement, many of them wiping away tears. The evening had transformed from a potential disaster into a powerful moment of learning and growth, touching everyone who witnessed it. As Maria prepared to return to her duties, she had one final thing to say. "Marcus," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "tomorrow, I'd like you to spend the day with our scholarship students. I think there's much you could learn from them, and perhaps after tonight much you could teach them as well." The evening was far from over, but already the atmosphere in La Maison Rouge had changed. Something profound had happened in that humble corner by the kitchen doors, something that would ripple out far beyond this single night in a high-end restaurant. As the weight of both Chuck's wisdom and Maria's revelation settled over him, Marcus sat in contemplative silence. The restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm of quiet conversations and clinking cutlery, but for him, nothing would ever be quite the same again. He watched as Chuck took another sip of his wine, handling the glass with the natural grace of someone who knew its value but wasn't defined by it. The same hands that had dominated martial arts competitions and starred in countless action films held the delicate crystal with gentle respect. "Mr. Norris," Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, "I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about every person being somebody's hero. I've been so focused on the surface, on maintaining what I thought was class and sophistication, that I forgot about basic human dignity." Chuck set down his glass and looked at Marcus with understanding. "You know what I've learned in my years of teaching martial arts. The student who comes in wearing threadbare clothes but has a fire in their eyes, often has more potential than the one with all the expensive gear but no heart. Marcus nodded slowly, memories flooding back. I was that student once, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Before I worked here, I was a busboy at a diner. I used to dream about working in a place like this. When I finally got the job, I think I became what I once feared. Someone who looks down on others to feel important. The revelation seemed to physically impact Marcus, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his realization. I became exactly the type of person who would have judged the old me. Chuck leaned forward slightly. Recognition is the first step toward change. You know, in martial arts we have a saying, the belt only covers 2 inches of your waist. The rest is up to you. A small smile tugged at Marcus's lips. I don't think I'll ever look at a uniform the same way again, mine or anyone else's. Around them, other servers were going about their duties, but their behavior had subtly shifted. The earlier stiffness and pretense had given way to more genuine, respectful service. They'd all witnessed what had transpired, and the lesson was infectious. You mentioned your youth program earlier, Marcus said, straightening in his chair. The work you do with kids. I'd like to learn more about that. Maybe even help if you'd allow it. Chuck's eyes lit up with interest. You know what makes a great teacher, Marcus? Someone who has learned from their own mistakes. Someone who can show others a better path because they've walked the harder one themselves. The words hit Marcus like a physical force. All evening he had been dreading the consequences of his actions, expecting punishment or humiliation. Instead, he was being offered a path to redemption, a way to transform his shame into something meaningful. When Maria mentioned the scholarship program, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, I realized I'd been wasting an opportunity. Instead of just serving meals, I could be serving hope, just like you do with your students. Chuck nodded approvingly. Every interaction is a chance to lift someone up or push them down. The choice is always ours. Marcus looked around the restaurant with new eyes. He saw the young couple in the corner, clearly celebrating a special occasion with carefully saved money. He noticed the elderly man dining alone, wearing a well-worn but dignified suit. He observed the family with teenagers, all of them dressed in their best but still looking slightly uncomfortable in the formal setting. I've been so wrong, Marcus said softly. All these people, they're not just customers to be judged. They're people with dreams, stories, and dignity of their own. Chuck smiled warmly. Now you're beginning to see with your heart instead of just your eyes. A profound change was visible in Marcus's demeanor. The artificial polish of pretense had been replaced by something more genuine, a humility that paradoxically made him appear more dignified than his previous affected superiority ever had. Mr. Norris, he said, standing up straighter, would you allow me to start over? To serve you properly this time. Not because of who you are, but because every guest deserves that respect. Chuck's response was interrupted by the arrival of another server with his meal, but his approving nod said everything necessary. Marcus's transformation wasn't just about this one evening or this one interaction. It was about all the evenings to come, all the future guests whose experiences would be shaped by the lessons learned tonight. The corner table by the kitchen doors, initially chosen as a sign of disrespect, had become the site of something remarkable, the place where one man's understanding of true dignity and service had been fundamentally transformed. As Chuck began to enjoy his properly served meal, Marcus remained nearby, his demeanor completely transformed from earlier in the evening. The waiter's previous air of superiority had been replaced by genuine attentiveness and respect, not just for Chuck, but for every guest in his section. Mr. Norris, Marcus said during a natural pause in the meal, I've been thinking about what you said about your youth program. Would you tell me more about it? About the kids you work with? Chuck set down his fork, clearly pleased by the genuine interest. Well, Marcus, we work with young people from all walks of life. Some come from tough neighborhoods, others from broken homes. But you know what they all have in common? Potential. Every single one of them has the potential to be something extraordinary. Marcus pulled up a chair with Chuck's encouraging nod. How do you help them see that potential in themselves? Sometimes, Chuck explained, all it takes is one person believing in them, One person who looks past their circumstances and sees who they could become. We teach martial arts, yes, but what we're really teaching is self-respect, discipline, and the understanding that their past doesn't define their future. Marcus absorbed these words, thinking about his own journey. Like how you looked past my behavior tonight and saw someone who could learn and grow. Chuck smiled warmly. Exactly. You know, in all my years of teaching, I've never met anyone who couldn't be reached if you approach them with genuine respect and understanding. I'd like to help, Marcus said suddenly, the word surprising even himself. I mean, if you'd allow it, maybe I could volunteer or... You know what we really need? Chuck's eyes lit up. Role models who can share their own stories of transformation. Someone who can tell these kids, I know what it's like to make mistakes, to let pride cloud your judgment, but I also know it's possible to change. Marcus felt a surge of emotion. You'd trust me with that? After how I behaved? Marcus, Chuck said firmly, if we didn't give second chances, if we didn't believe in redemption, what would be the point of anything we do? Besides, he added with a slight smile, sometimes the most powerful teachers are those who have recently learned the lessons themselves. Taking a deep breath, Marcus straightened his posture. What would be the first step? Come observe a class, Chuck offered. See what we do. Meet the kids. No pressure, no commitments. Just come and see if it feels right. I'd like that, Marcus replied, then hesitated before adding, but I have to ask, why are you being so kind to me? I was horrible to you earlier. Most people would want me fired, or at least want to see me punished. Chuck's expression grew thoughtful. You know what's easier than forgiveness? Holding on to anger. You know what's easier than teaching? Condemning. But easy isn't always right. The real challenge and the real reward comes from helping others grow. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Like you're doing with me right now? Life has a way of presenting us with opportunities disguised as challenges, Chuck responded. Tonight could have been just another story about someone being treated poorly because of how they looked. Instead, it's becoming a story about growth, about change, about the possibility of redemption. Looking around the restaurant, Marcus saw his section with new eyes. I've been doing this job all wrong, he admitted. I thought being a great server meant maintaining some kind of artificial superiority. But it's really about service, isn't it? About making people feel valued regardless of who they are or what they're wearing. Now you're getting it, Chuck said approvingly. Every interaction is an opportunity to lift someone up or push them down. The choice is always ours. Marcus stood up straighter, a new sense of purpose evident in his bearing. Mr. Norris, would you tell me when and where your next class is? I'd like to come observe, if the offer still stands. Chuck reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. Come a little early and I'll introduce you to some of the kids. As Marcus carefully tucked the card into his pocket, he felt as though he was holding more than just a piece of paper. He was holding an opportunity for genuine change, for making amends not just through words but through actions. The evening was drawing to a close, but for Marcus it felt more like a beginning than an ending. He had started the night as one person and would end it as another, someone who understood that true class had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with how you treat others. Chuck's transformative presence had not just changed one waiter's perspective, it had sparked a chain reaction that would continue long after he left the restaurant. And for Marcus, the real work of making amends was just beginning. The following Tuesday evening found Marcus standing outside a modest community centre in a part of town he'd never visited before. The building was well maintained but simple, a far cry from the elegant surroundings of La Maison Rouge. He checked his watch. He was 30 minutes early, just as Chuck had suggested. Before he could hesitate, the door opened, and Chuck appeared, dressed in a traditional martial arts GI. Marcus, he called out warmly, I'm glad you came. Ready to meet the kids? Inside, the dojo was alive with energy. Young people of all ages were helping to set up mats, some practicing moves in the corners, others chatting excitedly among themselves. What struck Marcus immediately was the mix of clothing. Some kids wore crisp new Jis, others wore worn t-shirts and sweatpants, but all were treated exactly the same. "Everyone," Chuck called out, his voice carrying naturally across the room. "This is Marcus. He's here to observe and maybe help out if he likes what he sees." A chorus of "Hello, Marcus," filled the room, the genuine warmth in their voices making him blink back unexpected tears. These kids, who had every reason to be suspicious of a newcomer, welcomed him without hesitation. "Sir," a young girl approached him, no more than 12 years old, wearing a carefully patched GI. "Would you like to help me practice my forms?" Marcus looked at Chuck, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be honored," he replied, "though you'll have to teach me. I don't know any forms." The girl, who introduced herself as Sarah, smiled brightly. "That's okay. Everyone starts somewhere. Mr. Norris says the most important thing is being willing to learn." For the next 2 hours, Marcus watched and participated as Chuck led the class. He saw how every student was given individual attention, how mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than failures, how success was measured not by perfection, but by effort and improvement. What amazed him most was how Chuck handled a situation that arose between two students. A boy in a new GI had made a dismissive comment about another boy's worn-out clothes. Instead of harsh punishment, Chuck turned it into a lesson about character. "James," Chuck had said to the boy in the new GI, "do you know why I'm wearing this old faded GI tonight instead of a new one?" When James shook his head, Chuck continued, "Because this GI tells a story. Every fade, every worn spot, represents hours of practice, of dedication, of growth. Never judge someone's worth by what they wear. Judge them by what they do." Marcus watched as understanding dawned on James's face, the same understanding that had transformed his own perspective just days ago at the restaurant. Between helping students and observing Chuck's teaching methods, Marcus found himself sharing his own story with the kids. He told them about his mistake at the restaurant, about how Chuck had shown him kindness instead of condemnation, about how he was learning to see people differently. "You mean you didn't recognize Mr. Norris?" one boy asked incredulously. "No," Marcus admitted, "but more importantly, I didn't recognize the value of treating everyone with respect. That was the real mistake." As the class wound down, Marcus helped the students clean up the dojo. He noticed how they all pitched in without being asked, how the more experienced students helped the newer ones, how no one left until everything was properly put away. "So," Chuck said as the last students left, "what did you think?" Marcus took a moment to gather his thoughts. I think I've spent years at La Maison Rouge trying to create an atmosphere of excellence through exclusivity. But here you've created something far more valuable. Excellence through inclusion." Chuck nodded approvingly. "You know, Marcus, there's always room for another instructor here, someone who understands both where these kids are coming from and where they could go." "I don't know anything about martial arts," Marcus protested. "But you know something equally valuable," Chuck replied. "You know about transformation, about the journey from judgment to understanding. Sometimes that's the most important lesson we can teach." As Marcus drove home that night, his restaurant uniform still neatly folded in his car, he realized that his journey of making amends was becoming something more, a genuine calling to help others avoid the mistakes he'd made. The elegant dining room of La Maison Rouge and the simple dojo of Chuck's youth program might have seemed worlds apart, but they were connected by a fundamental truth, that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Marcus had begun the week as a waiter who judged people by their clothes. He was ending it as someone who was learning to see the true measure of a person and helping others to do the same. 1 month after that fateful evening at La Maison Rouge, the restaurant had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. Marcus still worked there, serving guests with the same professional excellence, but now there was something different about his approach, a genuine warmth that had replaced his former artificial sophistication. On this particular evening, Marcus was serving a young couple who were clearly saving up for a special occasion. The woman kept checking the prices nervously, while the man seemed uncomfortable in his borrowed suit. A month ago, Marcus might have treated them with barely concealed disdain. Now he went out of his way to make them feel welcome, sharing his knowledge of the menu in a way that was helpful rather than condescending. "The chef's special tonight is excellent," he told them warmly, "and it's one of our more reasonably priced dishes. I'd be happy to tell you about some of our favorite wine pairings that won't break the bank." The couple's tension visibly eased, their evening transformed from one of anxiety to genuine enjoyment. As Marcus walked away from their table, he caught sight of his reflection in one of the restaurant's mirrors. He looked the same on the outside, crisp uniform, perfect posture, but his eyes told a different story. They held a wisdom that no amount of fine dining training could provide. 3 times a week now, Marcus spent his evenings at Chuck's youth program. He hadn't learned any martial arts moves yet, but he had become something equally valuable, a living testament to the power of change. He shared his story with the kids, teaching them that true class had nothing to do with clothes or money, and everything to do with how you treat others. Maria had not only supported his volunteer work, but had also implemented changes at La Maison Rouge. The scholarship program was now more prominent, with photos of successful graduates displayed proudly in the entrance. The restaurant had started hosting monthly dinners where the scholarship students could practice their skills by preparing and serving meals to their families who might never have set foot in such an establishment otherwise. Chuck still came to dine at La Maison Rouge, sometimes in a suit, sometimes in his work clothes after teaching at the youth program. He always requested Marcus as his server, not because he expected special treatment, but because he enjoyed seeing the continued growth in the young man he had helped transform. The corner table by the kitchen, the one where Marcus had tried to hide Chuck that first night, had been transformed as well. Maria had renamed it the teacher's table, and rather than being considered the worst seat in the house, it had become a symbol of the restaurant's commitment to seeing beyond appearances. On this evening, as Marcus finished his shift, he paused to straighten a picture that now hung near the entrance. It showed Chuck working with the kids at the youth program, and below it was a quote, "The true measure of class is not in how we treat those we admire, but in how we treat everyone else." The words had become something of a motto for the restaurant, a reminder to every staff member that their job wasn't just about serving food. It was about serving people, each with their own dignity and worth. As Marcus prepared to leave for another evening session at the youth program, he reflected on how much had changed in just 1 month. He had learned that true transformation doesn't happen in a single moment of revelation. It happens in the countless small decisions we make each day, in the way we choose to see and treat others. The story of the waiter who misjudged Chuck Norris had become a favorite among the restaurant staff, not because it was a tale of embarrassment, but because it was a story of redemption. It showed that anyone could change, that a single evening could set in motion a transformation that would touch countless lives. For Marcus, the lesson had gone far beyond customer service. He had learned that every interaction was an opportunity to judge or to understand, to exclude or to welcome, to diminish or to elevate. And he had learned that true class wasn't about maintaining standards of exclusivity, but about maintaining standards of humanity. As he walked out of the restaurant that evening, Marcus smiled at the thought of the young couple he had served earlier. Their evening had been special not because of the expensive surroundings, but because they had been treated with genuine respect and dignity. And in the end, that was the greatest service anyone could provide. The story would continue to be told not just in La Maison Rouge, but in Chuck's youth program and beyond. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected moments, and that it's never too late to learn what truly matters.